Okay, let's get started. Actually, tell you what, before I get started, there's one other thing I'd like to flag up to you while we're here. As I said, we've got lots of webinars booked for the coming year, approximately once every month, thereabouts. And obviously we'll be sending out emails about dates and topics and things as we normally do. There's one I would like to flag up though, because I think this one is going to be particularly useful and interesting. So we'll be talking to Robin Gerberan, who's from JISC, and he will be talking specifically about AI and the impact that AI is likely to have on the paralegal sector. And I think for all of us, whatever industry we work in, there's this kind of worry of, is AI going to take away all our jobs? You know, how's it going to work? I think the good news is it's probably not. That's my understanding. But nevertheless, always good to get an expert's view on how it will impact us and maybe what jobs it will create for us as well. I'm hearing lots about AI creating new types of jobs. So I think that's well worth listening to. So that webinar will be on the, I'm just double checking, yep, the 11th of April. So pop that in your diary. The 11th of April, we'll be talking about the impact of AI on the paralegal profession. Okay, that's all the things I wanted to tell you before we get started. So let's get started. So welcome to this first webinar of 2024, and we're going to be talking about business continuity planning. Now, you might wonder why we decided to talk on that particular topic. And the reason is that, unfortunately, NALP, and particularly Jane, had some very sad news. You may have heard earlier this year when one of our team members, Kirsty, very suddenly and unexpectedly passed away. And this was obviously a terrible shock to NALP, and particularly a massive shock to Jane, because Kirsty and Jane were very good friends and worked very closely together. And unfortunately, it's when something like that happens, that's kind of when you go, we haven't got all the things in place that we thought we had in place, or we haven't thought this through in the way that we thought we'd thought it through. And that was certainly our experience here at NALP. So we wanted to share with you some information about business continuity planning, and also some of the things that Jane had to learn while she was going through this whole process, and coping, of course, with the bereavement of a very close friend as well. So you can imagine, when you're coping with all of that, you want to make sure you've got it all right. And that's really what this webinar is about, to hope that you are never in that situation. In a way, we kind of hope this webinar is a total waste of time, but sometimes these things happen and it's always best to be prepared. So I'm going to ask Jane a number of questions. I said, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat. In the meantime, can I just introduce everybody as well, so you know who's with us? So Jane, who I'll be speaking to, Jane is our CEO of NALP. Giving you a little wave there. In the background, we've got Amanda, who's joining us as well. That's our former CEO and our patron. And as I mentioned, Nigel, who's actually heads up marketing, but is also looking after kind of technical and questions today as well on the webinar. So let's get started. As I mentioned, Jane, we, you've had this experience this year, pretty horrendous. No one wants to have to go through that experience. Can I ask you, first of all, though, to define, because I think lots of people think they know what business continuity planning is, but let's kind of let's just talk about exactly what is it? You know, what is a plan like that? What is it? What sorts of things does it need to think about? So let's get some definitions out of the way first.
Business continuity can cover an awful lot of things, and most people think of it of there being a power cut or a snowstorm or something, so people couldn't get into the office. And in previous jobs, I've worked in places that were on floodplains, and so looking at what would happen if there was a flood. People also used to think of the old thing of what, especially when lottery syndicates became a thing, of what would happen if their staff all of a sudden won the lottery and nobody was there to pick up and do the roles that they were doing, because they were all off on a coach to Blackpool or something, or probably somewhere nicer, but you know what I mean. And so that was often thought about. But all of those scenarios think of people being in one office, whereas nowadays more and more people work remotely. They were also thinking of you still being able to contact those people if you needed to. If you needed to ask for their advice or something, they were still contactable. Business continuity planning at one point used to be called disaster recovery, and sometimes I find it easier to think of that because it's a disaster happening. It is a worst case scenario. So you have to, when you're looking at your business continuity plan, think of what is the worst thing that could possibly happen, whether it be to a single key member of staff, as it was with Kirsty, or whether it be a larger thing that affects the organization, such as an IT outage or something.
Now, all of these things, and I know it's always good to think of worst case scenario, but let's face it, most of these things will never, ever happen. You know, they'll never
Yeah,
happen. You could go through your entire business life and it never, ever happens.
yeah.
So is having a plan really that important?
Yes, it is, because whilst it most likely, and I hope these scenarios don't ever happen to anybody else. I've certainly not something I would wish on anyone. But unfortunately, life is unpredictable and things do happen. Nobody thought that there was going to be a worldwide pandemic in 2020 and everybody was going to shut down and businesses were going to be closing and no one was going to be able to get together for even the simple things in life, or celebrations or anything. So even the good things they weren't being able to get together for. Nobody thought that was going to happen. The last time that happened was 1918. Most people that remember the 1918 ones were not going to still be alive today. So yeah, it's yes, we hope these things don't happen, but you do have to remember how many businesses were caught out by things like the pandemic, and how many have actually gone under because they couldn't get through that because they didn't have contingencies. And I'm not just talking financial contingencies here, I'm talking about the practicalities of when you do work in an office and not being able to get people into the office to keep working, even if your business would sustain that.
Now, you mentioned obviously the pandemic. Do you think things have changed a lot since the pandemic? Do you think that A, what we have to think about, but also how we operate has changed considerably as a result of that? And how does that impact continuity planning?
I think it's changed it quite considerably because a lot more people now work remotely or in hybrid sort of setups. So you're not with your colleagues every day like we used to be when we all went to one office to work. When you're in a single office environment, you are talking to your colleagues on a daily basis. You tend to be able to keep up with what is going on in their little bit of the business or what they're doing. It's a lot easier to hold team meetings and things like that because it happens more organically because you're already together. When you're in a remote working or a hybrid situation, you've got to plan those meetings. You've got to set up a Zoom or set up a Teams meeting or whatever. You've got to arrange them in advance as opposed to just shouting, oh, shall we just all get together because you're all in the same room? And and it is a completely different scenario. So it's like um, thinking of what would happen if someone's got everything on their laptop that they're working on, and they have, even down to they have a car accident or something like that, and the laptop is in the car and gets destroyed. Well, what happens to all the work that they've done that is being held on that laptop? If it's not up in the cloud where everyone else can get hold of it, how are you going to be able to continue that work? How is somebody else going to pick up while your colleague hopefully is recovering from that? It can be it's a completely different scenario we're in now as to someone coming into an office and working on a desktop, and so someone else can just sit in their seat and type away and get into whatever they were working on.
Um, the more you talk about this, the more it feels a little bit like to me as though it would be almost impossible and probably not practical to think of every single eventuality. I mean, because you could, I guess, go almost as far as, well, what happens if aliens land? But I mean,
Yeah.
you know, we have to sort of be,
Yeah,
we have to
have to be
balance
a
it
bit more
somewhere.
practical. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess where you draw your line would depend, wouldn't it? I mean, I guess if you work at NASA, aliens landing are likely to be a more important contingency plan you need to think about, whereas probably for us, well, not a lot we can do about that. So
No.
maybe not worry about it. So I guess it's different for every business.
Yes,
But I
it
think
is.
what would be interesting to talk about is, so NALP is kind of, I would imagine, in many ways very similar to a lot of paralegal businesses, in the sense that, you know, you've got staff working possibly in an office, possibly remotely, you're doing a lot of work on computers, those kinds of things. So it's not as though you're working on a building site where, again, there would be a different number of contingency plans to think about. So can we just run through, based on your sad personal experience, because obviously no one wants to go through that, but I guess if we're going to draw something from it, it must be the learning that
Yeah.
comes from something terrible like that happening. So what sort of things did you learn that you wish you'd known before, I suppose, is the way to ask that.
I learned that we get complacent very, very easily, especially when you're a small team. You Even though I spoke to Kirsty most days because we worked very closely together, so even though she was working remotely and she was working abroad, but where she was working, the internet was sometimes a bit flaky. The cloud server we used then was not always online because it wasn't a big one. We have moved now, but things like that. So if she would have a habit of starting to work and saving things on her desktop. Well, that means that I haven't had access to that desktop because even months later we haven't been able to get her possessions back because she's in a foreign country. Now, other things that it's just brought to mind, really, although it's not a direct thing that I had to deal with Kirsty, is the fact that we use an awful lot of freelancers. And a lot of small organizations rely on freelance um, uh, people to support them. And what is the setup with them when they're using their own? Is the actual physical equipment theirs, or does it belong to your company? And what rights of access do you have if it is theirs? So again, it just spun out from this. Well, her stuff was on her desktop. That desktop is actually belongs to the business, so I will get it back eventually, but I don't know when. And so I think the biggest thing that we came away with was that there's the practical stuff, obviously, of not being complacent and making sure if you're using a cloud like a SharePoint or something like that, that everybody is using it consistently, and even all their drafts and everything are put on there. People don't start their work on their desktop. Oh, it won't matter, I'll upload it later, because there may not be a later. And you also have to think about the mental toll that it takes on other staff members, because it does take quite make quite the impact on those who work with the person that you've lost. And you do have to think about that, because that can have other impacts on how the business progresses and how it carries on moving forward, because it can feel like the whole world wants to stop. And it's difficult to control that side of things.
And I think, as you say, that's not just staff members, but particularly if those people who've got particular close social relationships as well
Yeah,
with that person. So obviously it was much more difficult for you personally because you and Kirsty were so close,
yeah.
and then you have to cope with everything on top of it.
Mm.
So I suppose, thinking of that, you want to make sure that a lot of it you could almost do in kind of like robot mode, if that makes
Yeah.
sense, because that's probably where you are.
Absolutely. And the thing is, because if you've got a plan in place, somebody dying is already very stressful. It's one of the biggest stresses that we go through in our life is when we lose loved ones. That and marriage and moving house, apparently. But anyway, but it is one of the huge stresses that we have. And if you don't have a plan in place and you're suddenly also having to fight to find where all these gaps are and all these things are hitting you that you weren't expecting, that just puts more and more and more stress and pressure on you. So I think it's one of the things about having business continuity plans, and one of the things that it is designed to do is to relieve some of that stress, because whatever disaster happens is going to cause you stress. If you already know you've got things in place to deal with that disaster happening, the stress is lessened. If you haven't got any plans in place, the stress is increased tenfold.
I'm going to ask everybody, anybody got any questions? If you have, please pop them in the chat, and Jane, and I'm sure, will do her best to answer them for you based on her experiences. I know putting a plan together is going to be difficult because, as we said earlier, everyone's business is different, and how long is that piece of string that you travel down trying to work out what the worst case scenarios could be? So do you have any tips for starting it off? I mean, is there, do you just kind of brain dump? Do you perhaps get the whole team together and see if everybody could kind of come up with 5 disasters to put on the list? Is there a good way of at least getting, because I think with this, it's probably one of those things you're going to revisit as the business changes, but let's get something started.
Yeah. I mean, you've always got your basics of things like fire, flood, theft, not, that sort of thing. But then you've also in this day and age got things like cyber security. That's a huge one for business continuity these days. And pandemics, of course. Now that we've been through one, everybody, these are things that are on your brain. But then you've got to think of your specific business and how it's set up. Does everybody work remotely? Does everybody work from laptops? Who owns those laptops? If they're owned by the business, do you have a record of the serial numbers and everything like that so that you can show that those belong to you? Because if somebody dies unexpectedly, it's a sad fact of life that people will go, oh, look, this must belong to that person who's died, therefore it's part of their estate and can be given to their niece, nephew, second cousin, twice removed, whatever. And so you have to then start going, no, that's ours, we need it back. But unless you can prove that, that can then turn into a fight. Do you know who the next of kin are for all of your staff? Do you know who to contact if something happens during the day, during the working day? Do they know how to contact you if something happens to that person outside of work? There are all these things that you need to bear in mind. Now, larger organizations have a tendency to collect details like next of kin and stuff like that regularly, and they will update their records regularly. But smaller organizations don't, because very often, you've friends on Instagram or something, and you've got mutual friends. Oh, you'll just contact their mum through that or whatever. Well, that's not always practical, and it's always not the right way to do things if a disaster is happening. If you're contacting somebody because there's been a bereavement like that, you don't want it to be through a Facebook message. It's not very professional.
No. I think it's interesting, as you say, we can get very complacent, and it is difficult. And I know that so you recently wrote an article which has got a lot of coverage in the press, and it was about obviously continuity planning and based on your experiences. And I think the fact that the press was so interested and it got so much coverage actually just goes to show how we don't really think about it enough. And I get it. No one wants to think about it. And there's A, I don't want to think about it, and B, I've got other things that are much more important that can wait till tomorrow. But of course, how many tomorrows can it wait is
Yeah.
really what we're talking about. So I think we always share NALP coverage anyway, as you know. So if anybody wants to read that article, then we'll be sharing some of that coverage in forthcoming newsletters and things. Also, it's always, our coverage links always on the website too. So you can always go to the website and look for the coverage there, and you'll see that Jane's article got featured in a lot of places. I expect if you Googled it too, you'd find it. So there's lots of really, really useful information in that article. And it's certainly got me thinking, you know, for my own business about, well, at the very least, I kind of just need to make sure I know who to contact, they know who I am, we know who owns what, kind of thing. Because at the very, very least, that's I think the very minimum you want to do, because at least then if you've got the contact, I suppose you can, I mean, it doesn't solve every problem, but it starts the process, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And that at least is one thing that, you know, there's the items side of keeping lists, and then there's the people side of keeping lists. But I think the other thing is to have regular meetings with staff members to remind them why we do business continuity, why it's so important to save things to the cloud and what have you, because as we keep saying, the complacency sets in, and people might be fine for a few days, a few weeks sort of thing, remembering to save things to the cloud, and then they start getting complacent because, oh, the Wi-Fi is a bit spotty or something like that. So we do have, it's something that we do have to keep coming back to, and it's something that we have to keep reminding the staff and the freelancers and whoever is supporting us in our business, why it's so important to keep up with things being saved to the cloud, that they do let us know when they move house,
Yeah.
if their next of kin has changed because they've got married or they've got divorced or things like that. There's all sorts of things like that that do happen regularly in everyone's lives, that means that there's going to be a change to the details that we need as employers to be able to keep our business continuity plans in place.
Lovely, thank you. So if anybody's got any questions they'd like to pop in the chat, please do so. Now is the opportunity to do that, and Jane will do, or whoever will do their best to answer those questions for you. I guess the takeaway really is you're never going to have a perfect plan, because you cannot predict every single thing. I think that's the number one, is don't get obsessed with it being perfect. It's not going to be perfect.
No.
And I think the second takeaway is, but get started. Even if that started is just the basics, like, you know, so the first things we started with, for example, were, do I have next of kin? Do the next of kin know how to contact me? And are we clear about, you know, who owns what? And then there was some reminders that we did as well about, you know, you've all got the cloud, make sure you're saving there. If there's a problem that you can't save, you know, let's come and talk about it and see if we can sort that out somehow. But you know, but please don't put stuff elsewhere on your computer, and be aware that should something happen, we would need to get into your computer in order to kind of suck that stuff out, so to speak. And I suppose at the very, very least, especially if you've got a remote team, which we have, those seem like the minimum basics really to get yourself started.
Absolutely, yeah. It's there's lots of things that you can think about, but not every business is going to need all of them. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it is different if, for instance, like with Kirsty, she actually worked in Egypt for part of the year, and that was, you know, that caused additional issues. So you've got to think of that. If you've got remote staff or you work with people in other countries, not only have you got to think about that from a GDPR perspective, but you also need to think of that from a business continuity and how you're going to deal with that, because it's an added layer. But if you've only got people that all work within a sort of 10-mile radius, you've got a less of an issue with that.
And I guess one of those issues for working abroad in Egypt is language barriers as well, isn't it? With the people you might have to be dealing with, who are obviously dealing with the issues in the Egypt side that you're dealing with in the UK side. A lot to think about. Well,
An
thank you
awful lot.
so much for sharing that information and kind of getting us all thinking. I said, I think the key takeaway is don't get complacent and get started. It
Yeah,
won't be perfect, but do something, because anything you have in place is going to be better than having nothing in place.
absolutely.
So I
Yeah,
think that's really what it is, and it will be different for every business. But I said Jane's article, which will be on the website, but also, or you can Google it, will give you a really good starting place. Maybe listen back to the webinar and kind of think of some of the things that Jane mentioned that are really important, and hopefully that will give you a start. But also, I think bring the team together, just get
yeah,
to chuck out ideas, and that will
absolutely.
start to give you a good continuity plan. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. As always, it's lovely to have you here for the webinars. As I mentioned at the beginning, let us know if there's any particular topics you would like us to cover in the future. We're always keen to make sure that these webinars are what you need. So just let us know what you need and we'll do our best to fulfill that. Any questions, I said, pop them in the chat quickly. We've got a few more minutes. Nigel will be sending out a survey this afternoon on email. So please do look out for that. And if you've got a chance, please do fill it in. That would be lovely. We've got some more webinars coming up, but remember specifically a date for your diary, the 11th of April, where we'll be talking to Robin Gerberin about the impact AI will have on the paralegal sector. So I think that's very important that we kind of understand what that might do. And finally, could I leave you with a little ask, please? Please do follow us on social media. We have lots of social media accounts. Nigel has pasted them into the chat, so you can just copy and paste them out if you like. There's the website there, which I said, which is where you'll be able to find, for example, some of the coverage, including Jane's article, but others as well. We've got a Twitter account, we've got Facebook, we've got LinkedIn, and we've got the Paralegal Professionals group on LinkedIn as well. So please do follow us on those and interact with us there and post your questions and your comments and things. Also, on a lot of our social media accounts, we do post paralegal jobs. So if you're currently job hunting, then it's a good place to get some alerts for those sorts of things as well. So once again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much, Jane, for your input and talking about what I know is a very difficult subject to cover, and one that's emotionally difficult as well. So I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your experience with us on that. Thank you to all of you as well for joining us today. It's always lovely to see you on these webinars. We've got more coming up over the rest of the year, dates to follow soon, so do look out for the emails. And thank you again for being here. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you very much.